that you're live.
Great. I'd like to welcome you to the latest Interpretive Foundation Scripture Roundtable. This is one that deals with Chapter 21, or Lesson 21, in the Gospel Doctrine Manual dealing with the Book of Mormon, so for the year 2016. My name is Dan Peterson, and with me in this discussion are, from the left, on my screen anyway, Craig Foster, Ben McGuire, Kristine Frederickson, and then, of course, me. And this chapter, this lesson, discusses Mosiah chapter 29 and then chapters 1 through 4 of the book of Alma. And you get a lot of political stuff here, which looks pretty interesting. And so we'll start with Mosiah 29, and I think, Chris, you really wanted to get into this, if I'm not mistaken. Do you have something you want to say to lead us off on chapter 29 of Mosiah?
I do. I love any chapter that kind of treads lightly or deeply into political theory, and that's what's going on here in 29. And you see it also reverberating in 1 through 4. But I want to get a little bit of context. When we read Mosiah 29, one of the things we fail to do, because we live so contemporaneously, is we fail to recognize how radical and revolutionary these ideas were at the time that they were offered. So I'm going to give just a little bit of quick background. If you go back to, you can talk about pre the demos, you can talk about sort of, some people suggest tribal democracies, which are small groups that are organized, with people having a voice, and maybe in Sumer, maybe a little bit in Mesopotamia, perhaps a little bit in India, but you really don't get the manifestation of what we would call democracy until you really get to the Greeks. And the Greeks, about 507 BC, you've got Cleisthenes, and he establishes basically an Athenian democracy. And it's representative, but it is a democracy. Everyone, males, of course, and certain males, but they have a right to vote, and so they elect, and they have 3 different bodies in the state. And so that's really quite extraordinary. And then you can look at Rome, and if you look at Roman history, you get that Roman Republic about 510 BC. And it is a republican form of government where you elect representatives. So representatives represent you in the government. And it's mostly by the aristocracy in Rome. And the Roman Republic is going to last until it gives way to the dictators, basically Caesar and others. So what's interesting here, though, is with that in mind, when you think about 507 BC and then you think about the Roman Republic, 510 BC, you have to remember that Lehi and his family have left the Middle East by 600 BC. So they have absolutely no experience with any form of government other than monarchical government. It is kingship throughout the world, with perhaps a few little simple, digressions. And that's the form of government that they exist under. And then, they go to the point where they separate, and they separate, what is it, about 92 BC. Excuse me. No, they're going to separate in about between 588 and 570 BC. Nephi's going to take everyone and go off. And then this comes in 92 BC. So they've been living under kings. Most of the world is established under kings. And in reality, we really are going to continue with monarchical government. It's going to dominate the world until after the end of World War I. In World War I, you start seeing the breakup of all these huge empires that are under kings. You certainly have the American experiment. That's followed by the French experiment. And you do have political theorists who are starting to articulate other possible forms of government. But even if you get to, and I'm going to jump through, but you can look at Luther's doctrine of the 2 kingdoms, a worldly government under the control of God, and then a godly government under God, but God is over all. Then you've got Calvin. Calvin suggests the possibility, or it's interpreted to mean the possibility, of regicide. That's about as far as you go until you get to a few theorists who start arguing the possibility of constitutional monarchy, but we're locked in divine right monarchy, that God has chosen this king, and that individuals do not have any right to overthrow that individual, until really you get to Hobbes and Locke. So Thomas Hobbes suggests the idea, I'm going to just quote a little bit here, but Thomas Hobbes suggests the idea. He says, I put for a general inclination of all mankind a perpetual and restless desire for power after power that ceaseth only in death. And so what he suggests is that the state should be established, but it should be established based on the idea that it can keep order. So there's his thinking. And he can't even move to the next step. What about a state that doesn't keep order? That's left to John Locke. And John Locke is the individual that suggests the notion that in very limited circumstances, if a king does not maintain order in the state, then regicide is a possibility. You have some, leanings towards popular sovereignty or the notion of representative government. You see it in the English Civil War. All the soldiers that fight in the war try to suggest to Cromwell they should have the vote. That's put down really quickly. So here is this introduction of, we might suggest, theocracy. It's certainly a theocracy, but then here is, the king. And he's suggesting that my son doesn't want to be the king. We don't want to see the kind of horrors that come when you try to overthrow a monarch. And so he introduces this absolutely extraordinary proposition to them. And it's the rule of judges here, that these judges, and when all is said and done, what he's kind of establishing is sort of, where our laws are established, because they still have all those Mosaic laws. They still have all the Hebrew laws, I should say, and then they have the Christian laws before them. And so it really is a rule of law based on Judeo-Christian ideas and principles and doctrine, and that's what he introduces under judges. And there are checks and balances in this system. So it's a magnificent system, but it really was nothing that they could possibly have come to on their own during this period of time, is what I would suggest. So that's quick and that's fast, but it really is quite extraordinary.
Oh, yeah. Any other comments, Craig or Ben?
Well, just that some of this stuff, too, is driven by the experience of Alma and Abinadi and King Noah, right? We have this quintessential evil king who eventually is put to death by his own people. And we have another group, Alma goes off and forms his own community out in the wilderness, starts with a covenant-making process, right? Introduces this idea of baptism to his people as a way to enter this new covenant. He's defining the church as separate from the state, because under King Noah, the church and the state were virtually identical. And so when this group of people shows up and meets with everybody at Zarahemla, they've got all of these other ideas and notions, I think, that help to create kind of this shift towards what we see here.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps not intentionally, but it becomes some of the working experience that they need to be able to discuss these issues. And this idea of overthrowing the king and the fight behind it is very fresh on their minds because they've just been through some of this.
Yeah. Craig, anything you want to say?
Not really.
Okay. Well, I'll toss in one little thing that came to me a number of years ago when I was reading this. This has often been criticized as an example of Joseph Smith's 19th century Americanism coming through, that, democracy in an ancient text and all that sort of thing just doesn't fit. But one thing that struck me about it several years ago, and I actually wrote an essay about it that has been published, it's published in the Old Farms Review, is that Mosiah's concerns are not concerns of a Democrat, small d, for equality. His concern, he does express an interest in equality, but it's coming from the perspective of a monarch rather than from the perspective of a small d Democrat. I mean, if you read passages like verse 30 of chapter 29, he says, I don't want you to have a king. He says, if these people commit sins and iniquities, they shall be answered upon their own heads. In verse 34, he says, he told them that these things ought not to be, but that the burden should come upon all the people, that every man might bear his part. And then in verse 38, therefore they relinquished their desires for a king and became exceedingly anxious, that every man should have an equal chance throughout the land. But again, not as Democrats, but every man expressed a willingness to answer for his own sins. And Mosiah's concern is that the king bears all the responsibility and it's not fair. He wants equality, not in the sense that he's advocating democracy in our modern sense. He doesn't want the king to be responsible for everything. everything. He's concerned about his sons and so on. And I remember I'd already written a piece on this, and then I saw Henry V, Shakespeare's play. I saw the famous film version by Kenneth Branagh. And there's a wonderful scene where Henry V is wandering in disguise through the camp of his soldiers on the eve of the Battle of Agincourt. And several of them are saying things like, well, you know, I don't know if the king's cause is just or not, but if it's not, you know, the blood's on his head, you know. And Henry laments that it's not fair that everything rests upon the king. He says the king is just a man. He's wearing this fancy garb, but, you know, is it right that everybody should blame their sins and their problems, that everyone's soul, the burden of that rests upon the king? It's a very interestingly monarchical view of equality. It's looking at equality from the other side. And what struck me was that's here in Mosiah 29, too. This is Mosiah speaking as a king, not Joseph Smith speaking as a Jacksonian Democrat.
Well, in fact, so now I do have something to say. and because your comment reminded me that Ben and I actually had a little discussion, when we were just getting started. And we were talking about the fact that, a lot of people misunderstand this. And like you brought out, the critics of Joseph Smith and of the Book of Mormon will say, oh, see, here is Joseph Smith throwing in his ideas of democracy. Well, if you really look at it carefully, it's not democratic. You have a chief judge, and who ends up being the chief judge is the chief judge's son, et cetera, et cetera. So this is not a democratic process, it may have echoes of some democratic ideas, quote, quote, but it is not, as you were saying, it's not Jacksonian democracy. And so Joseph Smith wasn't throwing in Jacksonian democracy into that.
Mm-hmm.
I do think if you're, like, when I'm bringing a perspective, Mosiah's perspective here, I do think, too, one of the things we're seeing here is that Mosiah, as a prophet of God, he understands how critically important individual agency is. That's where I think this rule of judges is located. He understands that as long as I am making the laws and I'm controlling your lives, I am responsible. And he certainly has seen the pattern before of Nephi, and he's very clear about, in verse 17, behold, how much iniquity doth one wicked king cause to be committed, and what great destruction. He knows what happens when there is regicide. He knows what happens when there is a civil war, the kind of destruction. And we see the horrible destruction when we get on in the Alma chapters, when it's, when there is that civil war, because the infrastructure of the state, the lands, the people, it's totally depopulating that particular state. So it's horrific. And that civil wars are always that way. But one of the things I think King Mosiah recognizes is that what we need to do is, it is critically important that we prevent regicide by my son rejecting and then saying, okay, now I do want to be king, and then you're going to get a civil war. And so what's the best thing to do? The best thing to do is to do what Heavenly Father would want us to do, is to create a form of government where individuals are allowed to live with freedom and liberty, and they are free to choose. And he makes that perfectly clear when he organizes this government. I'm just going to jump through a few. So the first thing he says, and you're kind of right here, Craig, because this isn't your typical democracy. I call it kind of a democracy theocracy / because it very much is based on picking good, righteous men to be the judge.
I think we lost her for a minute there.
Yeah.
Judeo-Christian in the land, and they are as they have. And so here we have. So here it is: judges to rule based on laws, based on Christian commandments. That's in verse 11. And then he says, he starts describing what laws you should not break: no stealing, no plunder, no murder. So see, we find those. That's our same sort of Judeo-Christian package. And then he says, he talks about unrighteous kings, pervert the rule of law. 25 through 26, choose judges based on, basically he says, majority rule. That's a key concept that we've sort of lost in our country. We've spent, if you look at the Constitution, we're supposed to choose our leaders based on, and we're supposed to, the law of the land is, the Constitution says based on the will of the majority. But we fail to understand, I think, in American society, or many people do, that you are to protect the rights of the minority, but you're to rule based on the will of the majority. And what we have started to do oftentimes is to take up the cause of the minority to supersede the will of the majority. I think that's perhaps some of the anger we're seeing right now in this country. Anyways, so he talks about, choose based on majority rule. The people are going to choose, and when they start to choose wicked, then see, it's on them again. They will suffer, and the Lord makes that perfectly clear too. And then in verse 30, the Lord commands them to set up this kind of a government. And then look at the checks, because even when they do choose those judges, then you also have a condition where, and this is something we don't see in our Constitution, which would be kind of nice, we do have the rule of law, where a case makes its way through the court, to the higher judges, to the Supreme Court, and then they determine whether or not it is constitutional based on the rule of law, the laws that have been established. Well, they say the same thing here, but then they do something that I think is really inspired as well. They also say if those higher judges, so those judges on that, say that Supreme Court level, if they seem to be deviating from the law as well, you can choose judges that are at the, you get a small group of those lower court judges, and it is their responsibility to judge whether they are judging appropriately based on the laws of the land. So, see, this is what they're instituting, which is what's critical in American society. Our protections really do lie in the Constitution, because the Constitution is based on the rule of law. That's where our liberties lie, in the rule of law. And that's the kind of government he is setting up here. Now, he understands people can choose to be wicked, and they can choose to violate the laws, and that's where, I don't know if it's Amlicide, but that's where Amlicide proves to be such a threat, because they know very well if he takes control and if his people have their way, they will start changing the laws, which is perfectly viable, and and it would have been viable if that would have been the way it happened, but it didn't. And so, we see a lot of real similarities here, but again, it harks back to how critically important it is that we obey the rule of law. And even then, and although we don't particularly enforce it today, it is about that Judeo-Christian law code that we base our laws upon, and they certainly are doing that here. And then agency and liberty and freedom are available, and that's why the people are so thrilled. That's why they're so excited, because they understand, my goodness, look at the liberty. And then you mentioned, I think it was 34, Dan. Oh, yeah. There's the other thing that's intrinsic to the success of any democracy or republican form of government. And it's made very clear here. The burden now for the state and the success of the state comes upon all the people if every individual bears his part. So go back to Greek. In the Greeks, everyone had to have a position in the state at some point in time in their lives. Those men that were citizens of Greece, they had to have a position in government. It was required of every citizen of the state. And we have a responsibility, even if we don't have a position, in government, we still have a responsibility to be good, informed citizens in the state. And that's how our freedoms and liberties will persist. And so he's making that clear. I think that was made clear, for us in our day too, with that Constitution, which is a standard for the world. The Lord made that clear as well too.
One other point I might mention, related to the point that I made earlier, you have this concern. He says, the eldest son, who is the rightful heir to the kingdom, has declined. He says, but we need to do something, because what if later on he says, you know what, I've changed my mind, I do want to be king? And you might say, well, yeah, he'll cause a lot of war. That he does say that, but his other concern is for the soul of his own son. He says, in verse 8, we have no right to destroy my son. Neither should we have any right to destroy another if he should be appointed in his stead. What if my son went back to the vain ways he had before? Remember, the sons of Mosiah had this sort of checkered past, to put it mildly. What if he goes back to that? And think of the damage he could do. But he's really concerned about the kingship destroying the soul of his son, which is really an interesting thing to me. Again, he's seeing it from the monarch's perspective, from, in this case, the monarchical father's perspective. It's not just in the name of democracy. He's worried about the instability that a claimant to the throne could cause, and so on. I may have told an experience on a previous roundtable here. I can't remember if I did or not, but I had the experience a number of years ago. This seems apropos here, to be the tutor to the daughter of the Shah of Iran when he was in exile in Egypt. And at one point, we were reading history, and we were reading about the Bolshevik Revolution, and suddenly, she was about 16, suddenly she wanted to know, well, why on earth did they kill not only the Tsar, but the Tsar's family? You know, and I thought to myself, this is maybe the only person I will ever have the occasion to meet and talk with who has a personal stake in that kind of question, you know. And so I had to explain to her, well, you see, as long as there's a claimant to the throne out there, that's a menace to the regime. In this case, the Bolshevik regime, and they wanted to eliminate all of those children so there could be nobody who could claim the throne. And of course she said, oh, yeah, that's awful. Well, she would, because she was in exactly that position. There were attempts on the life of the Shah's family, and in fact, one of her brothers died under rather mysterious circumstances just a few years ago. Supposedly suicide, but a lot of people don't think so. It's very suspicious. But anyway, you know, there is that as long as there's somebody out there who has not exercised his or her right to the throne, but who could conceivably at some point step forward and gain a following, that is a threat to the stability of whatever regime it is, good or bad. And so he's worried about that. But again, the perspective is that of a ruler. You know, I don't want factionalism in my state, but he's worried about the soul of his son, and that strikes me as uniquely proper to him, that he doesn't want that responsibility stuck on his son. He wants his son to be saved.
And the perpetuation of peace.
Yeah.
And you see throughout, I mean, European monarchy, so often there is that usurper and the threat of the usurper. I mean, look at Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots.
Oh yeah, the whole history of England through much of that period is who is the legitimate heir to the throne. Somebody comes up, the head of the House of York or the head of the House of Lancaster, and you know, and they're disputing the parentage of this one, or is he really the closest relative to the king?
And going a little bit beyond that time, you have you know, the Stuarts, the pretenders. You have the old pretender, the young pretender, and ironically, to this day, the House of Stuart still has a pretender. There's you know, he's not trying to take over the throne now. You know, they live a nice, comfortable life in France, but there are still descendants who have titles. You know, they'll have the title, even though it means nothing. But that's still at that time it did, you know, mean something. They tried, and that's the reason why we have 1715 and then 1745 into 46. You know, of the pretenders.
Yeah, and all of this really does prove just the extraordinary foresight of Mosiah. It's amazing that, and you know, really, and you've articulated several perspectives, but the perspective of a monarch who does not want his kingdom to devolve into civil war.
Right.
The foresight of a loving father who does not want his sons or his family embroiled in those kinds of contests where oftentimes family members are forced to take sides. And then the foresight of a loving father over his people, if you will, who again wants them to bear the responsibility for the choices that they make, and this is the perfect political construction for that. It really is, you know, like I said, you don't see anything like it really until you get well into the 18th, well, you know, we start with, you know, some political theory really. We get a lot of political theory in about the 16th century, but it really doesn't come to fruition until, you know, we get to, you know, French Enlightenment thinkers, and then we get the American Revolution based on a lot of that, you know, Scottish, British, and then French political theorists, and then you get the French Revolution after that, but not until then. And then, so here's someone, you know, who is left far before the creation of the Greek or the Roman Empire, and yet here are these, you know, extraordinary ideas, political ideas.
Yeah, well, it's good stuff. I don't know. Are we done with Mosiah 29? Do we want to go on and give a look at Alma 1, or do you want to, Ben? Do you have something to say?
I have one more comment. Yes. There's one other very, very profound thing that happens here, and we're going to jump back. I'm going to jump back to Mosiah 26 from the last roundtable. This is verse 8, and it says, "Now King Mosiah had given Alma the authority over the church." Before Alma can reorganize the church, so to speak, before they can have a reformation that comes with Alma's arrival, right, from the wilderness with his group, the king has to give them permission. And this isn't all that different from Noah picking his priests, King Noah, that were going to support him in his wickedness, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that happens here in Alma 29 is that we decouple the management of the church from the political establishment. And this is really a major step, and it really has a lot of implications later on, but the priests are no longer tied and connected to the judges. Now they are at first, right, because Alma is both the judge and the high priest, but he steps down from one position to take over the other full-time, and that really cements that, or finalizes that break. And then from here on out, the church manages its own affairs very independently from the political governments that exist.
Yeah.
And that remains that way all the way through the rest of the Book of Mormon.
And Mosiah, I think, is helping along with that process, because you may remember it. Alma goes to Mosiah for guidance on how he ought to do church discipline, and Mosiah says to him, "Don't come to me. That's your business. You decide that." Then he gets a revelation. This is the beginning of the separation, and Mosiah is saying, "No, really. When I'm talking about separation, I mean it." Yeah. But again, you may see it as Mosiah trying to push that responsibility off. I don't want to be responsible for this. I've got enough on my plate. Don't make me responsible for even church discipline and spiritual things.
Yeah, his Moses moment. I can't do this all. I just cannot. I must have other people. So organize into 10s, 100s, 50s, whatever.
Yeah.
And then my last comment is this. They describe these new leaders' positions as judges. I can't help but speculate that this may be related to readings from the Old Testament, where the Old Testament has a period of judges, and they're called judges, and in a sense, this becomes the model that they're looking for it may be no more than in title, right? But it gives them that description of a position that's different from a monarchy, and they have a history that they can go back to and say, see, it's worked before. God didn't mind. Moving to a king from that setup was considered kind of universally a bad thing. So it's feeding off that entire history in Israel, and really among the Nephites too, who have been through good kings and bad kings. That idea that we want a king, we need a king, and kings are bad, but we'll live with it.
Right. Well, and I'm wondering what the word behind king is. I know Arabic, the relevant, slightly relevant language that I'm best acquainted with, the term hakim means judge, but it also can mean ruler. You notice that Alma goes out to battle, as the chief judge, but he's not just a judge in black robes on a bench in a judicial proceeding. He's the head of state as well, and it means judgeship. The very word for government in Arabic is hukuma, from the same root, which means judgeship but government too. So, but it's not king. Very different from that. So.
Well, I think we should probably move on, because otherwise we won't get through our material.
Right, and the fact is, this chapter we could go on for a long time. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. We get into the book of Alma, though, and you begin to see the implications of what Mosiah has done. Mosiah dies early on in chapter 1, and then Alma is holding the judgment seat, and there's a man brought before him who we find out is Nehor, and who wants to say something about Nehor? Great guy.
A type, a prototype, an archetype, whatever, of many of these wicked individuals that want to subvert the law to their own purposes. And you it kind of reminds me of, what's the Neil Diamond song, Brother Love's Traveling Salvation Show? Now, here you have the individual who is, of course, interested in personal aggrandizement and power and money, and he's gifted and he's big and he's large and he's commanding presence, and he's doing everything possible to subvert the laws. And that's why, again, there you have verse 1. The first thing it says is that Mosiah had established laws and they were acknowledged by the people. That's critical. So see, look at the voice the people have here. Therefore, they were obliged to abide by the laws. But we're going to get back on even farther to Amlis. I'm jumping the gun here, but the same thing. Those laws are based on, so this is where you really do see some separation here. Those laws are based on the laws of God, according to Mosiah and others. Here, by the time we get to Amlisai, and Nehor recognizes how he can use those laws to his advantage, liberty to speak freely, freedom of speech is one of the things that we see. But by Amlisai, he realizes, man, if I can change the laws, I can move away from those Christian laws. I can create whatever laws I want. So here comes Nehor, and he is preaching against God, and he gets a following because it's what Bonhoeffer describes as cheap grace.
Yeah. He
offers the people cheap grace. You believe in me and follow me, and you're saved.
Well, I noticed at the end of verse 1 where it says that the laws are acknowledged by the people, therefore they were obliged to abide by the laws which he had made. There's a kind of social contract idea there, that the reason they are accountable to the laws is they have accepted the laws. It's like saying, okay, making an agreement with a person of kind of contract, will you do A, B, and C? And when you say yes, then you are, prior to that maybe you weren't obliged to do A, B, and C, but now you are, because you took that obligation upon yourself. That's how they can be held accountable. But he comes and he says, for one thing, that that every priest ought to be popular. Every priest and teacher ought to become popular in verse 3. And, I thought, well, what does that mean? I looked up a translation just to see how they took it. The German says they ought to be volkstümlich, sort of the people and beliebt, beloved. And
forerunner of the televangelists.
Yes, I mean you're out there. I think it's a prescription for a demagogue. You give people what they want.
That's true.
Where a person who's been called by God may or may not say things that are popular among the people.
Right.
He's under no obligation to do that. But a person who gets his support from the people must necessarily try to, you want to increase the size of your evangelist tent, get more love offerings. I don't mean to take aim at specific people here, but but you see that kind of thing. I remember years ago an account of a rabbi up in Connecticut, I think, some really well-heeled area. This is probably at least 10 years ago. And he'd been fired by his congregation because he decided to come in and start talking to them about the fact that, in his view, they were too materialistic and that they ought to part with some of their money, give it to charity and things like that, that they were greedy. And so what was their response? They fired him because, of course, his employment in that synagogue as the rabbi and preacher was entirely up to them, which means that in a system like that, you can't really go against what the people want or their desires because they'll release you.
And isn't that definition of popular? I mean, really, if you're going to give it a definition, it's you are saying what the people want to hear.
Yeah.
And they want to hear how easy it is to go to heaven. They can do anything they want. They can be uncharitable. They can be greedy, and he's greedy. They can, dress, they can spend all their money on themselves and extravagantly dressing, and you're all going to heaven. So that's what they're meaning by popular. Say what I want to hear. Don't tell me.
They want to hear how good and righteous they are.
They're the opposite.
Yeah.
But, for me, I see this strange contrast here, because his message is a message of equality in a sort of very pure sense, right? God created all men, he redeemed all men, and all men are going to have eternal life, and you should support me. The other creatures, in a lifestyle that we should become accustomed to, there's that strange disconnect there, you know what I mean? Between saying that all people are equal, but And you know, in many ways, it is this funny sort of issue, because if in fact what he says is true, there's no need for him.
Right.
Right? He's the bearer of good news, but there's no need for him as an authority figure. And there's no need for him as a teacher, because there's really no need to worry about sin and prophecy and judgment and all that, because that's already all taken care of. It's all done.
Yeah.
There is this real inconsistency in his message, perhaps we could say that that's always the case when we deal with populist messages, right?
Yeah. You know, maybe they'll want to give him money, because if ever they start feeling any doubts about being, you know, I'm okay, you're okay, and that doctrine, I'm going to be saved, well, it's good to have him around to reassure you that, you know, everything you're doing is just fine.
Yeah.
But the fact is, if they don't support him, then they're under no moral condemnation, because there is no moral condemnation. Yeah.
And where he really is needed by them and essential to them is that he provides them the alternative to what Mosiah and Alma and others are saying. And so everyone can locate themselves there, and, you know, and so that allows them to quite easily reject then the truth of what Alma and others are teaching.
Well, what's very striking, one of the things that's very striking to me, is then you have the description of the church later on, where the priests and teachers labor with their own hands. It's a very direct and deliberate contrast to what is being taught by Nehor, his ideal of a church that would have sort of an aristocracy of preachers of smooth things, you know, to borrow Elder Holland's borrowed phrase. And yet in this, the teacher is no better than the student or the learner, and the preacher is no better than the hearer, and everybody works, and they take a break from their labors so the preachers can preach and the listeners can listen. It's an egalitarian vision. It's really quite an interesting one. Anything else about Nehor and his teaching?
One of the interesting things, I think, is under the laws that they've crafted, of course, free speech within certain boundaries. And you see this a lot among demagogues when we use that term, is that it's free speech for them. And so then when he encounters Gideon, here comes Gideon, and Gideon, you know, is contending with him. And because he can't seem to best him with his words, then he's going to draw his sword, and he's going to silence him whatever way possible. And we see this in the world today, you know, free speech for, you know, certain groups, but then when other groups try to speak freely, they're going to be vociferously condemned. And, you know, at this, you know, point in time, he's going to use the sword, which of course leads him to come before the judge. And it's quite important as well. And look at verse 14. He tries to defend himself, and he's obviously very good at what he does. And yet they say, you know, here is what the judgment that's passed upon him. Thou art condemned to die according to the law, which has been given us by Mosiah, our last king, which has been acknowledged by this people. And then this is critically important. Therefore, this people must abide the law. That's really powerful. When you move outside the rule of law, what's your alternative? It's anarchy and chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And they understand that. And that's something that perhaps is a little bit lost on our society today. But we have no alternative but to put you to death, because if we don't, then we've started on a really slippery slope. And so he is executed.
Yeah.
Violation of the law. Yeah.
His killing of Gideon, I think, is particularly offensive. You know, Gideon wasn't just any preacher or teacher. Gideon was this hero of the rebellion against King Noah and so on. And now he's an aged and presumably venerable and respected man. And for this guy to come along and cut him down in an unfair fight between a young, big, vigorous guy and this old, heroic, you know, formerly heroic man who's now way past his prime. This is just an offense. You know, obviously, you know, he may have been a cunning fellow, but that was an extraordinarily stupid move. The end was predictable. They're going to catch him, and he's definitely going to die. You don't cut down a hero that's popular in the society without paying the price for it. So.
And it perhaps too reflects his overweening sense of self. And, you know, when anger comes, you know, he kind of just sort of that sense of, I can stop anybody that steps in my way, and he does.
Yeah, yeah. Ben.
I was just laughing because it really reminded me of a certain saying that somebody said recently about being able to shoot somebody and not face any repercussions. He really felt that way though, because he argued, it says, quite vigorously at his court, right, with boldness.
Yeah.
I haven't done anything wrong. He had it coming to him, right?
Yeah.
He pulled his sword first. Mind you, we couldn't find the sword when we were done, and
Right.
I've always been fascinated by the end of verse 13 there, right? And were we to spare thee, his blood would come upon us for vengeance.
Yeah.
Really, very Mosaic law type in nature, that statement, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it is.
This idea that what he has done is capable of bringing a curse upon the whole people. That iniquity has to be dealt with, or the community as a whole, and he spells that out again in verse 14, as we pointed out. But this is their way of talking about it in that kind of language that they have brought with them with their scriptures, right?
Yeah.
That blood crying up for vengeance is the curse from the ground that would stand that they as an entire community would receive. If they didn't answer for this crime and deal with it.
It's a very ancient notion. It was not only the Hebrews, but among the Greeks, you have the Furies, who chase you down to extract vengeance. Or I just a couple of weeks ago reread Oedipus the King by Sophocles, and there the problem is that there's been a murder, right? And so the city is under a curse. The city of Thebes is under a curse. And the murderer has to be punished, either killed or expelled from the city, or the city will continue to be under this curse. And Oedipus, of course, swears, yes, we'll get that man. We'll see that vengeance is taken upon him. And it turns out that he is the one who committed the murder. And the interesting thing is, in this case, it's one where he didn't even know he was doing it. That is, in some senses, he's almost innocent. But this idea that blood requires blood is there, even if it wasn't intentional. The debt has to be paid. I suppose that's why the news of the atonement was so welcome for among ancient people. There was a sense that justice has to be done. So that's it. But that is a really striking statement. Yeah.
And then in verse 16, right? Nevertheless, this did not put an end to the spreading of priestcraft through the land, for there were many who loved the vain things of the world, and they went forth preaching false doctrine. This they did for the sake of riches and honor. Mm-hmm. Nehor had disciples, and they saw an opportunity, and he isn't mourned at all. It is an opportunity to move up in the Nehor religion, right?
Yeah, he's left a vacancy
at the top. That's really the kind of the sense that you get, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And except that they've learned their lesson, and as it goes on to explain that they started to become very careful to make sure that they followed the letter of the law,
right.
So that they couldn't be brought to court and they couldn't be sued, and they kind of pushed it. And so we see, I think, in many ways, what Chris was talking about. Even though they have issues and they're spiritually bankrupt, right? That rule of law, that social contract, really holds and works very well for them because they're willing to keep it and they're willing to carry out the punishments that are listed in there when they need to.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. We're using that term, social contract. See, that takes us all the way back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, French Enlightenment, who wrote the social contract, who kind of, articulates this idea, which is inbred in, of course, what Mosiah is teaching.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Can I get one other little thing about Alma 1?
Yeah.
And it's fascinating, too. They begin to persecute the disciples of Christ. They begin to persecute the members of the church. And you get in verses 20 through about 31, you get this extraordinary I would call it a quasi-sermon on the requirements for disciples of Christ, how disciples of Christ act in the face of religious persecution. And here's just some of the things that are mentioned, that disciples of Christ are required to be humble and not proud. They are not to persecute others, verse 21. They are to remain steadfast in their faith, faith, verse 25. Verse 25 again, they are to keep the commandments, bear with patience persecution. Verse 26, they are to seek out and listen to those who are preaching the word of God. So when someone is preaching, go listen. Labor with your own hands, the gospel of work. That's what you were talking about. Even the preachers, all are equal. 27, the requirement to be charitable to the poor, the needy, the sick, the afflicted. Avoid costly apparel, but be neat and comely. And then 28 to 31 sort of articulates the idea that they are required to be peacemakers. This is what we're hearing from the brethren today. I mean, you know, as we're talking about, particularly Elder Oaks, as he's talking about, you know, the increase, and I think Elder Christofferson has talked quite a bit about this too, but you know, the increase in the persecution of Christianity and that, and those are the very requirements that they have articulated for us in our day as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's so many things that could be said about this, it seems to me. Again, we've still got 2 more chapters to deal with, but I'm struck by the important lesson there is here. This is relevant to some of us who've engaged over the years with critics of the church, that there's a warning against coming to blows or, you know, becoming contentious with those who are contentious. And it's really easy to fall into that, you know, when people are really obnoxious. And you may have noticed that sometimes in comment sections on newspapers and on the internet and so on, some critics of the church are not exactly models of polite and civil behavior.
No, really.
But it's very easy to slip into that mode in responding to them and to lose a temper and so on. And this is a strong warning against that the Lord doesn't want contention, and it's not a matter of not contradicting charges against the church and so on. It's a matter of not becoming contentious or angry or uncivil in doing it, or even violent in some cases. Although I don't think there are many cases of that right now. But that's an important lesson to be learned from this. There was one other thing that I wanted to pick up, which is that the people in the church began to prosper and become far more wealthy than those who did not belong to their church, because, it says in verse 32, those who didn't belong to their church indulged themselves in sorceries, idolatry, idleness, babblings, costly apparel, you know, spending money on things that don't produce. And you know, this I think is plausible. I'm not preaching a prosperity gospel here, but the habits that are developed in the church do tend to create prosperity, not wealth, because when you become wealthy, you tend to pass it around, share it with the poor, which is what's been described in the preceding few verses. But general prosperity, that is an orderly life that is not given to drunkenness and that sort of thing, will, on balance, lead a community to become relatively prosperous. Not poor, probably not extremely wealthy, except in rare cases. But, you know, I could point to cases that I know of where people have joined the church, for example, in third world countries, and you know, well, one case in particular that I think a friend of mine was in a restaurant in Honduras or Guatemala or someplace, and the fellow that was waiting at their table in this hotel restaurant was named Moroni. Well, you know, it's a little suspicious there. So this table of Mormons who were visiting archaeological sites said, "Are you LDS?" And he said, "Yes, I'm working here to save up money for my mission." And they got to talking with him, and he told about how his father had been the town drunk in their town, and then had joined the church, and was currently serving as the branch president or the bishop, I don't know which, and this kid was getting ready to go on his mission, and he said, you know, the gospel saved my family and saved my father's life. And I know a lot of stories like that, where it's brought people around just to teach them good habits of living. It's not peculiar to Mormonism only. I know that in some areas of Latin America, converting to evangelicalism has been a real step forward for people, because they begin to take, you know, their lives seriously and try to live a moral and ethical life and reform their habits, and it can make a real difference. So, anyway.
I want to add just one thought to that, though, and that is just that I think that we're seeing a little bit of hyperbole on the part of Mormon here.
Oh, possibly.
And we're going to see some of this through the rest of Alma and Helaman, right? Because in verse 23, now this was in the second year of the reign of Alma.
Yeah.
So only 2 years have gone by, and yet we have this massive class distinction forming between the members of the church and the non-members of the church. I think that there may be some of this, but I think to the extent that he's painting it, he's trying to make a point as much as he's trying to portray an accurate actual distinction between these groups of people.
Well, Mormon is nothing if not moralizing. I mean, he's definitely always trying to make a point with what he's doing.
Well, and coming from his background of what he was witnessing, it's human nature to you really want to warn. You're going through a horrible thing, so you really emphasize certain points based on your own experiences.
He couldn't help but think, as he's looking back on past history from the vantage point of his position in the end of Nephite society when everything is falling apart. And it's, the most horrible crimes and the destruction of his society. He can't help but be thinking how much living the gospel would have benefited his people. Things wouldn't have been going well. As a friend of mine used to say at the bottom of all his emails, he used to say, what was it? Where are we going and why are we in this handcart? Or hand basket, I guess.
In the hand basket.
Yeah. So almost ruined that joke, but anyway, and he felt and he was. His society was going to hell in a handbasket, and he could see that. He could see how living the gospel does, on the whole, make your society run better. The fact is, as people have said, if you don't have a law-abiding society, that you can't hire enough police to enforce the rules. If people don't, by and large, obey traffic signals, you can't make them. They have to be in the habit of, even at 3 in the morning when there's nobody around, if it's a red light, by and large, they'll stop, right? And that makes it relatively easy to govern a society like that. But if everybody says, to heck with it, we're living no rules, it's every man or every woman for him or herself, there's not much you can do. Well, maybe we ought to move on to chapter 2, because by my reckoning, we have at most about 10 minutes more. So sorry about that, but these chapters are just so interesting. The Book of Mormon, for the product, as some say, of a shallow frontier yokel who dictated it in about 2 months off the top of his head, strikes me as a remarkably rich and complex book. Maybe I'm just too dumb to see it otherwise, but that's the way it appears to me. Well, chapter 2. Where you meet this guy, Amalekai or Amlisai, however we pronounce his name, who decides he wants to be king. Anybody want to say something about that? We've kind of said things about it already.
Well, I think that there's one important thing that maybe we can mention now, and that is that I think that this represents an underlying tension that's been existing for at least 3 generations. When the Nephites first come to Zarahemla and meet the Mulekites, they are a small group of people. The Mulekites are much larger, and yet they convince them, because they have this record of their fathers and the brass plates and so on, that they're the rightful rulers, and their king becomes the king of this combined group. And I think that we're about to be introduced to for the first time to a group that's eventually going to call themselves the Kingmen. They've seen that the Nephites have lost their king. They have no more taste to have a king, and they want it back. Mm-hmm. And so I think to some extent we are seeing some under the surface class distinctions coming to the surface. Former aristocracies and important families wanting to become important again, wanting to have that control. All of these things are going to feed into this, and certainly this guy, he says, was a disciple of Nehor, so we already kind of have a feeling for what motivates him. Mm-hmm. But I think in many ways there are some political tensions that still exist, and we are really, I mean, they've been kind of silent up to this point, but now they're really going to come out in this new environment when we're trying this new form of government. And it's very fascinating to me that this is 5 years in now, right? Mm-hmm. This is very, very quick. Mm-hmm. These people are not happy with the way things are going. I think that they see this shift that had happened as a move away from their chances of becoming what they want and managing the people, and so they have to really step in very quickly to head things off.
Mm-hmm.
Well, given that for the most part, the Book of Mormon is not a history. We kind of approach it at times as a history, but the reality is it's missing so much information that it's not much of a history. For all we know, they may not have been as silent as we think. Now, were they causing civil war? Probably not. But they're like Ben was saying, obviously there were these underlying tensions, and they could have existed all along with kind of a semi-vocal group over there on the side, kind of at least saying that, look, we should be the rulers, but your great grandfather or whatever gave that up for these usurpers or whatever else, and then they see their chance and they're going to go for it.
Mm-hmm.
Just a thought there.
Well, and one of the I think subtle but nevertheless implicit messages here too is that this, whatever you want to call it, theocratic democracy, whatever, but nevertheless, this is a very fragile experiment. I mean, this is a very, very difficult form of government to maintain. And I'm going to take you back to that Hobbes quote. He says, "I put for a general inclination of all mankind a perpetual and restless desire for power after power that ceaseth only in death." And that's exactly what you're seeing here. People long for control and power over other people's lives, and there has to be some kind of checks and balances, and it's just not going to work. It's just not going to work here with Amalekite. He is going to lead a rebellion. He's going to get enough followers, and I think it's fascinating when you start looking at the numbers too, to try to get a sense of how big this society is, because in these battles, you've got the Amalekites killed 12,532. The Nephites killed 6,562. That's a pretty significant number of people.
Yeah.
So we're seeing some pretty, I mean, I don't know that we have or anybody has tried to estimate the number of, people that are, in this community. But when you get those numbers, it's a pretty sizable community.
Well, I think that's not trying to get off topic too much, but I think that's yet another example of, or another indication that there were more than just the Nephites and the Mulekites and the Lamanites floating around in this society, because I mean, even going back to the end of Nephi, Second Nephi, and the beginning of Jacob, where they're talking about, like Nephi had used his sword to fight, many battles, blah blah blah. Well, there aren't that many people. How many battles would they be able to fight before there's no one there, unless they were having other people there. And like I said, I don't want to get off too far, but it does show that obviously they had to been mixing with other peoples, especially when you look. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Craig.
I was just going to say, when you look at the numbers that you just mentioned and how many people were killed, they have to be mixing.
And also, jump ahead, I mean, this is jumping ahead, but jump ahead to Alma 4 when they finally reassert peaceful relations, and they say they have 3,500 converts. Well, where are those converts coming from? They're not coming from the Lamanites, that's for sure. And so, and we're not talking about reconversion, but they've got 3,500 people that they're going to baptize. So this is a community within a wider community, or communities that are bumping up against each other. So. So the Book of Mormon is about a family. It's about a family.
It's a lineage history. I think the illustration that I like to use to illustrate that is is Samuel the Lamanite, who is a really important prophet, but we know nothing about him before he shows up on a Nephite wall. And we know nothing about him after he jumps off that Nephite wall. Now, one possible explanation might be that if he's jumping off Arnold Freeburg's wall, he's dead. But the description.
Those muscles might keep him alive.
But the description of the walls actually in the Book of Mormon text, they're much more modest affairs than that. The fact is, he's important to the Book of Mormon narrative only insofar as he impacts a Nephite city. Yeah. Great prophet though he is, we know nothing about his career among the Lamanites before or after, because it's relentlessly, rigorously a history of this line. And so you can't construct a history of the Americas from the Book of Mormon, I don't believe. It wasn't intended to be, and we're told there were other plates that had things like that on them. These are not those plates. So when people say it's a history of the American Indian, no, it's not, and it never was intended to be, any more than the Gospels are biographies of Jesus. You know, they say something about his birth. He pops in when he's 8 or 10 rather, and then all of a sudden he's 30. You know, and what happened in between? Oh, they're not interested. So Joseph Smith's retitling of the four Gospels in the JST version as the testimony of Matthew, the testimony of Mark, testimony of Luke, testimony of John, I think is brilliant, really insightful. That's what they are. But I'm getting really far afield, and we are actually coming up against, at least to me, a deadline. Ben, did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, let me wrap up chapter 2 really quick, right?
Okay.
We have a civil war. The Amlicites are beaten badly. Mm-hmm. They start fleeing into the wilderness, and they encounter this massive Lamanite army. And they join them, and they turn around, and the Nephites win, but they decide that it's a miracle, essentially, right? But it just goes to show that in this setting, their enemies are not unaware of the fragility of their society. These Lamanite armies have seen an opportunity. There's no king there. This is going to be easy pickings.
Right.
And they get routed.
Yeah.
But it really is this blessing from God, and they attribute it to their prayers and their faithfulness that they're able to survive. And this, of course, leads to those conversions we were talking about, right? The fact that they can see that praying to God has an effect, and these soldiers get home and tell their families, maybe there's something to this. I think we'll stick with it for a little longer, and so on. So
yeah,
it's interesting too. I mean, 3. I think we could basically describe 3 as the curse that was placed upon them. Then chapter 3 it just talks about the cursing. But when you go to 4, it's interesting with what you just said, Ben, because not only does this 3 talk about the curse on the Amlicites, but look at in verse 3, it says, the people mourned, and notice the phrasing, and believed it was the judgments of God sent upon them because of their wickedness. He doesn't say it was the judgments of God sent upon them for their wickedness, but they believed that was the case, and so they reformed their behavior. Mm-hmm. It's just interesting the way that it's worded there.
Well, we have gone longer than I thought we were going to go. I don't know. I have one thing that I wanted to say about chapter 4, and then if other people want to say something, maybe we should have our say and close down. But if you have something that's really burning to say it. I'm struck by the fact that when the church begins to falter in chapter 4, because they do prosper, and that prosperity, in typical Book of Mormon fashion, leads them to become worldly and so on, and they begin to fall apart and set their hearts on things of the world and so on. And when Alma decides that he really needs to deal with this, it's striking to me that he has 2 offices. He's the chief judge and he's the high priest. And he gives up the chief judgeship to someone that he trusts and decides there's nothing he can do for them that would be better than, it says, bearing down in pure testimony against them. I think it's striking that he saw that as the more fundamental thing, and I agree with it strongly. I'm a political junkie. I love to read and follow politics and so on, but I think culture is deeper. Politics reflects culture, and if a culture is fundamentally flawed, that would yield bad politics. Most often not the other way around. And so he chooses to go for the more, what he sees as the more fundamental thing, which is not not the details of administration and so on. It's not going to be policy changes. His culture, as he sees it, is sick, and he needs to deal with that. And it being a religious culture, the most fundamental thing he can do is to preach and to testify and to try to call people to repentance. So thinking he can't do both, he chooses what to him is the more important, more fundamental thing, the thing that will actually tend to fix both problems, I think. And that is just significant to me and believable. So, anything else you want to say about chapter 4?
No, it's beautiful.
My final comment would be this. It talks about this in verse 13. We can sometimes measure our spiritual success, right, by our prosperity. Mm-hmm. That's part of the lesson that we learn here. But true success is measured not by how well off we are, but by how well we treat those in our society that are not well off. Mm-hmm. How well we take care of the poor, the needy, the naked, the hungry, the sick, the afflicted. We can be wildly successful as a society, but if we see them all around us and we do nothing, we are complete failures. And I think that may be the most important lesson that we learn here. And that was the way that they noticed that Alma saw that his people were going to be in trouble very soon.
Right. Excellent point.
Yeah.
Craig, do you have anything you want to say?
No.
All right. Well, probably because we've gone at least an hour and 5 minutes. Probably ought to wind it up. But I want to thank the participants in this. I'm Dan Peterson, and again from the left, Craig Foster, Ben McGuire, and Chris Frederickson. And we've been discussing Mosiah 29 and Alma 1 through 4, which is lesson 21 in the 2016 Gospel Doctrine Manual. So thank you very much.